Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Pyrrho and Epicurus. So for this one I will have the Epicurus one will be a lot longer just because a lot of his writings have remained to this day, but I wanted to put Pyrrho first just because he came first chronologically and he was also an influence on Epicurus. There isn't as much to say on Pyrrho because there pretty much no writings of his own still exist to this day, but nonetheless I wanted to cover him because he's a very important and influential individual who has had sort of ripple effects on many of the future philosophers we'll be going through in the next portion of this video series. So without further ado, let's begin with Pyrrho. So Pyrrho was considered the first Greek skeptic and also the founder of Pyrrhonism. Obviously, Pyrrhonism, no surprise there, but the first of the Greek skeptics. So we'll also have some other skeptics we'll be talking about later. So he was born in what's called Elis. So this was actually where the first Olympic Games were held. So this is where Olympia is. So obviously it would be, I would say, in terms of his upbringing, he probably had a pretty, at least global or metropolitan perspective, because a lot of people from around Greece would go and visit this area or would be in his own hometown or own home region. So he probably at a young age got sort of a larger worldview than maybe some other people who were born in perhaps smaller regions in terms of population and significance. It's said that also Elis participated in the Trojan War according to Homer, like many of the Greek states, but I think this also probably had a large influence on Pyrrho, both in terms of philosophy but also in terms of his understanding of humankind and sort of the nature of people's actions. So it's also located on the Ionian Sea. I think there's no coincidence that many of these philosophers or great thinkers happen to live on the ocean. I think there's something sort of mind-opening about just having the ocean in front of you. Yeah, so he was originally a painter, and he actually achieved somewhat decent success here. His paintings were supposedly featured in the local gymnasium, so he probably could have lived his life quite comfortably as a painter in his own right, but he sort of gave up on that. And he ultimately never ends up becoming rich, but he was respected across all of Greece. He ultimately gets given Athenian citizenship, and he also becomes high priest of Elias. So he was heavily influenced by Democritus. This is also true of Epicurus, as we will see soon. And fortunately for him, along with Anaxarchus, he got to travel with Alexander the Great in his conquest into Persia, as we can see down here. So even more so, he was born in a somewhat a global city-state. He was fortunate to have the opportunity to be able to travel into Asia, or East Asia at least, as a scholar. So it's said that he got the opportunity to speak with the gymnosophists in Persia, who were considered probably mostly following Jainism, and also the gymnosophists in India, who were predominantly Jainists. And you could see, I previously made a video on Mahavira, who was grew up as a Jainist, but he sort of started his own sort of sect of the religion. So, and you can very much see the parallels in terms of Pyrrho's philosophy and the Jainism philosophy, which I will elaborate on later. And he also got to speak with the Magi in Persia. Some critics say that it's, and I think it's well-intentioned. I think they're trying to give Pyrrho full credit for his ideas and say that they solely came from him. But some critics say, or some people who speak contrary to the critics say, it's almost impossible for him to have gone down to Persia and India as a scholar and not to have picked up some of these ideas, especially considering he was gone for 18 months. That's sufficient to learn a language, but also, like, he just needs one translator to be able to accomplish this. And I'm sure with his intellectual curiosity and his drive to switch from a painter into a philosopher, there's no doubt that he picked up some of this, and you can see this very clearly in his philosophical thoughts. So just traveling also sort of inspired him to want to create a different philosophy, because I think that which he learned from Democritus and some of the other contemporary philosophers at the time in Greek wasn't really covering what he had sort of discovered in his trips in Asia. Much of what we know is predominantly written by an individual named Sextus Empiricus, who's from Rome, but he wrote about Pyrrho over 400 years later, so much of it could be a little bit off. Additionally, one of his students, Timon, who is also a very famous and great thinker, but also a writer and poets, poetry, satires, and plays as well, wrote in his History Siloi, Lives of Philosophers, so that's some of the other sources about Pyrrho, but not much is known there other than his influence on others. So his main idea, and this is also an idea that's very, very relevant to Epicurus, is that related to ataraxia, which is essentially freedom from stress, worry, and fear. So here's this quote, which is pretty much, this is not even written by him, but it's a reference to him, but this pretty much sums up his whole philosophy here. So, whoever wants to live well, eudaimonia, must consider these three questions. First, how are pragmata by natures? So pragmata is like ethical matters. So basically the first question is what are ethical matters? Secondly, what attitude should we adopt towards them? So how do we address these ethical matters? Thirdly, what will be the outcome for those who have this attitude? So what will be the cause or the effect of these actions? So Pyrrho's answer is that as for pragmata, they are all adiaphora. So adiaphora means undifferentiated, essentially. So all ethical matters are the same, is what he says there. Astathemeta, sorry about my pronunciation, which means unstable, unbalanced, and not measurable. And unepikrita, which means unjudged, undefined, and undecided. So therefore neither our sense perceptions nor our doxai, which is views, theories, and beliefs, tell us truth or lie. So we certainly should not rely on them. Rather we should be adoxastoi, which means without views, aklinis, which means uninclined to that, to this or that, so impartial, and akridantoi, which basically means unwavering and refusal to choose, saying about every single one that it no more is than it is not, or it both is and is not, or neither is or is not. So basically it's kind of a basically the first question is there are these ethical matters that people spend their whole lives trying to answer are just unmeasurable and they can't ever be answered. So the second answer is what should we do? Basically nothing. And thirdly, that you'll sort of achieve happiness from this. And that's essentially the center of his philosophy. Where he differs from Epicurus, and we'll get to that more in the comparison, is that he says, therefore neither our sense perceptions nor our doxae tell us the truth. So Epicurus actually believes that our sense perceptions are true. So we'll get to that later. So yeah, I guess one last quote as to Pyrrho: the great subverter of Pyrrhonism, or the excessive principles of skepticism, is action and employment and the occupations of common life. So basically, where many contemporary philosophers, especially those relating to like Democritus, they spent a lot of time well, Democritus was actually the founder of atomism, so he's a little bit different. He's more of a scientist, but a lot of these philosophers spent a lot of time getting into the nitty-gritty, what is true, what is false. And Pyrrho has this exercise. So, for example, if there's any sort of question, try to fight for both sides of the argument until they're balanced, and then give it up. So he basically thought that to get true happiness or ataraxia, one must sort of just live a simple and common life, and this ultimately leads into skepticism, and it's even still very much practiced today. So yeah, that's Pyrrho, and I think this will make a lot more sense as we talk about Epicurus, because Epicurus was in some ways heavily, or in every way, very heavily influenced by Pyrrho, and sort of might shed a little bit more light on this. But basically, he's sort of a skeptic, and basically don't spend your life worrying about pragmata, because they cannot be measured. So moving to Epicurus, so there's a lot more to say here. So he was the founder of the Garden, which was a new school kind of contrary to Plato's Academy, and the father of Epicureanism, so very much like his own name, Epicureanism. Yeah, so he was born in Samos, which is an island, and his parents were both Athenian, so sort of like, Athens and Sparta as well were probably the two strongest states at the time, but Athens was a little bit more, there were more opportunities to get involved in philosophy if you were from Athens, because that's where many of the notable philosophers were at the time. He was heavily influenced by Democritus. As we'll see, did study physics, where Pyrrho, as we know, did not. He was a student, studied Aristotle, Pyrrho, and possibly the Cynics, although he in some ways denies this. So, I guess we'll just start off. So he was born about 7 years after Plato's death, just to kind of put him in a timeline, and he was 7 years old when Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Persia. So this probably, the globalization he was seeing probably heavily influenced his philosophy, because he sort of took a more lackadaisical approach to everything. So maybe he saw what Alexander the Great was doing and perhaps didn't like it, and that might have heavily influenced his philosophy. So it's said that he received a typical Greek teaching. Norman DeWitt says it was impossible to escape Platonic teachings in geometry, dialect, and rhetoric at the time. So Plato was obviously so famous, and it's pretty much impossible to say that Epicurus was oblivious to Plato, but nonetheless he goes out throughout his life to sort of oppose Plato, sort of as his objective. After Alexander's death, Perdiccas expelled the Athenians from Samos, so he was forced to leave his land, and he was forced to live on the Turkish coast. And this probably had a pretty big influence on him as well. This probably is where he gets his hatred for people's pursuit of power and wealth, because he saw its abuse in him being removed from his own home. He did his military service in Athens, and it's said that he probably met with some of the Stoics there, for sure. But either way, he followed Nausiphanes, who was a student of Democritus, and then later Pyrrho. So he never actually, or as we know, he didn't actually know Democritus firsthand, and he probably didn't actually know Pyrrho directly, but his teacher probably did. But he considered himself strongly self-taught, or he vehemently said that he was self-taught. So this kind of is a big part of his character that I'll start revealing now, is that he was sort of self-absorbed and sort of egotistical, and this is where he, it said that he had just as many individuals who opposed his beliefs as supported him. And to this day, he produced about 300 writings, but only very few of them last. But there's a magnitude higher, or a multitude of works against him that still last. So there's more writings that criticize Epicurus to this day than writings by Epicurus or in support of Epicurus. So take that with that what you will. So in terms of cynicism, it said while he was in Athens doing his military service, there was an individual called Diogenes, as you might have seen in the previous video when I talked about the cynics. It's pretty much impossible that he could have avoided seeing these guys, because they were obviously doing something very noticeable. But he did oppose them. He thought that the cynics were a little bit vulgar in their attitude. So what the cynics would do, for example, Diogenes, he was known for living in a big urn on the ground, and they would live in rags and stuff, and just to and shun anyone who was rich. But Epicurus sort of disagreed with this, or criticized that, in that sure, it would be good and nice and to live in rags, but you don't need to shun people, and you don't need to be vulgar about it. Just sort of do your own thing. But he did support with their quest to sort of find happiness. His writing style was considered very much like a Socrates, but later it sort of gets a little bit like Euclid. Euclid wrote The Elements, which is one of the most famous books on mathematics, or it is the most famous book on mathematics, and one of the most famous books of all time, probably like top 5, especially in terms of influence. If you've read pretty much anything on geometry, it was written in Euclid's Elements previously, so very, very influential book. Another very important book, I would say, if you were to create like a classical library, if you're starting from scratch, some books that you would need to have a copy of Plutarch's Lives, you would need to have a copy of Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, which is pretty much many of these lives that I'm talking about now are in Diogenes Laertius' book. A copy of Euclid's The Elements, all the religious texts, and then some more modern philosophers, as you choose. So yeah, that would just be a classical library that I would. Oh, and obviously include Homer. You should have a copy of the Iliad and a copy of the Odyssey as well, just because they are both enjoyable to read, but also very, very important. So yeah, he radically opposed Plato, and additionally Zeno of Citium, who was one of the first Stoics, although he was much younger. So this is important in that I guess it gives credit to Zeno of Citium. I think it's a sign of respect when an older person criticizes someone younger, because it treats them like an equal, even though they are criticizing them and going against them. It definitely elevated Zeno's stature. The school he built, interestingly enough, was built about halfway in between Plato's Academy and the Stoa, which was Zeno's school. Or Zeno did come later, he was younger, but it's interesting. So I would say Epicurus was somewhat halfway in between the Stoics and Platonism, both chronologically at the time, but also in terms of beliefs, interestingly enough. So ultimately, the school was actually the first to allow women to join, not as an exception, but as a rule. So obviously a forward-thinking idea on his behalf. And they practiced strict diets, very much as you saw in much of the Eastern philosophers, like Mahavira and Buddha. They practiced strict diets, but also the Pythagoreans, they practiced strict diets. It seems to be a very common thing and especially the cynics, or the Stoics, would stick to very strict diets as well. It said that Epicurus was actually probably a vegan, except on his birthday, though, they would have these huge celebrations, and he was treated as a hero. So once again, proving his egotistical nature. Ultimately, he died at 72, a painful death, because he had stones in his urinary tract. So a very painful death, but apparently he lived happy. He had a happy death. And left his garden school in good shape to continue spreading Epicureanism. So, like Aristotle, he was what's called an empiricist. So empiricist would be like senses or observations are the truth, and nothing but that can be considered the truth. Whereas Plato thought that senses were not the source of knowing, but knowledge. And even further, the skeptics thought that even knowledge, or even senses, and knowledge could not be known. So Epicurus sort of sat in the middle of that, I guess you could call it, I don't know, in the middle of that scale. So he did believe that senses could be observed, and that they were the only truth. And senses are never false, but they could be misrepresented. And the only way to get more knowledge is through experience, and knowledge would ultimately lead to ataraxia. And ataraxia, that is the same ataraxia that Pyrrho sort of coined. So ataraxia is the freedom from pain and fear. So I guess the most important thing about Epicurus is that Epicurus believed that all evil and all selfishness and all crimes are caused by individuals fearing death. But he says, and here's a quote to reference it: "Accustom thyself to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply sentience, and death is the privation of all sentience. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not." And also his epitaph: "I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care." So basically he says that there is no afterlife, so death doesn't need to be feared, and from that there is no need to be greedy or fearful of it. And that's sort of his main philosophy. He thought that one should follow their gut for ultimate decisions, even over abstract maxims, codified laws, or even logic. He thought that one's gut was the real truth, and if one doesn't follow their gut, they'll fall into guilt. But in terms of good and evil, he actually didn't believe, well, he believed that gods existed, but he did not believe that they influenced humans or had any involvement in day-to-day life. He thought that God was sort of like a, he says, like an animal, but he did not want to attribute anything to it worldly. Kind of like Xenophon said. He said that if horses created a god, their god would look like a horse, and that was sort of an example of how ridiculous it would be to assume that God would look like a human, or to apply a human characteristic to it. Here's the Epicurean paradox, very famous, been requoted by many individuals, but God, he says, either wishes to take away evils and is unable, or he is able and unwilling, or he is neither willing nor able, or he is both willing and able. So, if he is willing and unable, he is feeble, which is not in accordance with the character of God. If he is able and unwilling, he is envious, which is equally at variance with God. If he is neither willing nor able, he is both envious and feeble, and therefore not God. If he is both willing and able, which alone is suitable to God, from what source then are evils, or why does he not remove them? So that's the paradox. So if God is omnipotent, it would be evil to not fix it. So basically, this is not an argument that God does not exist, because Epicurus actually did believe that he exists. He just believed that he wasn't influencing the world. David Hume also references Epicurus here, sort of phrasal of that last statement. Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? So the same question. If but once again, Epicurus did not disbelieve in God. So, and the reason why he believed in God is that he believed our senses could observe the gods in the heavens. So in the interstellar space, he could look up, and he believed that he could actually sense God or even feel it. And also, it said that it was probably important for him to still include a God in his philosophy, ultimately for pushing for the goodness. But even without the God, I think his philosophy would have stand alone, because he says that even though there is no afterlife, he said that to do evil would cause guilt, which would bring one away from ataraxia. So, yeah. In terms of his philosophy regarding physics, so as I said, he was followed Democritus. So Democritus was probably was one of the first atomists. So he believed that there's these small atoms that are moving through space, and there's basically atoms and the void. This later got expanded, so we now have the electron, the neutron, and the proton. But this is pretty much what his would have looked like, these little things flying around. And it said that Epicurus could have observed this, for example, like when a ring sort of rusts away, or when like a stone gets smoothed down, there's obviously small particles. But where he actually differed from Democritus was that he believed that there was what's called the atomic swerve. So there was, and this is kind of an argument against determinism. So where Democritus thought that these atoms were infinitely moving in space, and also Epicurus also believed that space and time were infinite and boundless, but Epicurus believed that there was this swerve that could be caused, a deviation in the normal movement of atoms, and this he would attribute to free will. So a small, different, but completely original thought, and I think it's kind of a beautiful thought, because if you think about it on a molecular level, like if our brain is just a big pit of molecules moving around, you know, I don't like the idea of it completely being determined. I think there's something, maybe tiny minuscule deviations in the movement of these atoms that ultimately create our consciousness and create our manifestation in the world. So I think it's a pretty beautiful thought. Maybe it's not true. I think it would be cool to look at a deep microscopic level at the molecules in our brain and see if there are any sort of deviances, because, you know, even I don't know, just a tiny, like, minuscule sized deviance in a molecule could have ripple effects and ultimately create consciousness, or ultimately create life. So that's, I think, a nice thought. And I don't like the idea of determinism. I don't want to think that everything is just set in stone. I like to believe in the idea of free will. So I think a very beautiful thought in that regards. So in terms of politics, he really didn't want to get involved with any of that, very much like Pyrrho, and it's probably the aftermath and the result of his experience with the collapse of, or because he lived through the collapse of Alexander the Great's empire, so it was sort of, there was a big power struggle between them, but he thought that people should not involve themselves in power. And he advocated for seclusion and live without pursuing wealth or power. But he did believe that justice was an agreement not to be harmed or to be harmed. So essentially the social contract, very much like Jean-Jacques Rousseau is very good about the social contract book, which is obviously a very good read, and I think I would definitely include that in a classical library, but I don't even think that would be considered classical, because it's not modern, but it's way after this. But either way, and all laws and punishments should be in accordance with justice, and justice is essentially saving harm from being harmed. Any law that is not in accordance with justice is unjust and should not be included. So bare minimum laws in order to create the social contract between people. Yeah, so he was considered a hedonist. So a hedonist is one who believes pleasure is good and pain is bad. But this is, I think, probably incorrectly applied. So he did not believe pleasure was just, like, you know, good feelings and, like, good food or whatever. He thought that pleasure was the absence of suffering. But nonetheless, he was pretty much shamed for many years following even within his own lifetime and after, as he was seen as a drunk and a whoremonger, which is very, very far from the truth. In fact, he was a vegetarian. Maybe he did have these big extravagant parties, but it doesn't really align with his philosophy. But nonetheless, he was sort of criticized for this. Here's a quote by him to sort of further that. The pleasant life is produced not by a string of drinking bouts and revelries, nor by the enjoyment of boys and women, nor by fish and other items of expensive menu, but by sober reasoning. So a couple things there. Firstly, I think it was obviously very weird, and we see a lot of parallels here that there was a lot of sexual intercourse with boys and women, but nonetheless, Epicurus never had children, so fish were expensive at the time. But yeah, basically he did not really believe in much indulgences. Despite these big parties he would hold on his birthday and being treated like a hero. So I guess from there you could derive maybe he was a hypocrite, because he was, criticizing people for pursuing power and for trying to gain wealth and stuff, but he already had it, so he would say, oh, don't go into politics, but he was already treated like a king at his own school, and he already had these big parties, like one who's rising in the ranks in politics. They're not, maybe they wanted to make good change and great change, just as he was able to. So perhaps a little bit hypocritical there, but I doubt he was really a whoremonger and a binge drinker, especially based on his philosophy. But who knows, maybe he was. From there, I guess in terms of his ultimate influence, he was, it said that during his time, the amount of followers for Epicurus were bigger than some cities, so very, very big, and it said that he was the first missionary philosopher, so it's kind of said to be paved the way for Christianity to come some years later. But and it also took off very quickly and within his own lifetime, unlike Pyrrho, who wasn't really famous until 400 years later when Sextus wrote the book on him. So ultimately, it even lasted much into the end of the Roman Empire, but ultimately Stoicism took over, and by the time Christianity came, it pretty much got wiped out, because they're very much similar, where they both value forgiveness and goodness, and in terms of characters, Epicurus has been related very much in like a Jesus-like figure. So Christianity pretty much wiped him out. And Augustus of Hippo says, its ashes are so cold that a single spark could not be struck from them. So he thought that Epicurus's religion was completely dead. But in the 15th and 16th century, they were translated into Latin, and it started to get prominence again, but more in a negative sense. So during the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants would criticize the Catholics for calling them, you're a Puritan, and the Catholics would criticize the Protestants, saying that they are a Puritan. So it still brought it back to light, even though maybe in a negative way. In the 17th century, they were revived by Pyrrho, a French philosopher and writer, Walter Charlton in England, and Robert Boyle, an Irish chemist, actually sort of brought back to life the Epicurean atomism. So, and yeah, he thought it was superior to that of Democritus because it was actually more practical. Later, the word epicure, so Epicurus was still considered a drunk and a whoremonger, but epicure sort of changed. The word epicure became a term to refer to a person with refined taste in food. So still, once again, Epicurus is associated with indulgence, but maybe not as bad. It's probably more of a comment, and the word epicure can be found in even Shakespeare's work. So still, his influence lasted, and it continued to last. So eventually, Sir William Temple and became a follower of Epicurus because he saw the value of living in obscurity. So William Temple gave up his powerful post and went to live a sort of normal life. Also sort of parallel to Pyrrhonism as well. John Locke followed Gassendi and picked up many of Epicurus's works, and ultimately individuals such as Thomas Jefferson said, "I too am an Epicurean." So Thomas Jefferson obviously wrote the Declaration of Independence, so that has had a huge influence on the United States of America as well. So, and that is, you can see that in Thomas Jefferson's life. You know, he believed that, you know, people should have their own farms, and that was sort of should be their own sort of plot of land, and the state should kind of stay out of their affairs, and sort of very much an Epicurean belief. So still very relevant today, even though a lot of people probably don't even know the name Epicurus. They're those living in the States or any sort of Western country are heavily influenced by him. Ultimately, also Marx supported Epicurus, sort of similar to Robert Boyle. He saw that he liked his theory of atoms. He thought it was more practical than Democritus as well. So yeah, that is Epicurus. Yeah, I guess I've included a lot of these images here. These are from the Nuremberg Chronicles, which is also very important. It was one of the first books to be printed. It essentially accounts the history of the Bible and then a modern history, and pretty much all the philosophers, great thinkers that I've included sort of have been included in the book, or at least those who made the cut. So that is Epicurus. So I guess in terms of a comparison between Pyrrho and Epicurus, so as stated earlier, Epicurus, like Aristotle, was believed that the senses were sort of the foundation of knowledge, like whereas Pyrrho did not. He thought that even the senses could be considered false. That's why he's considered a cynic. Both were founders of their own philosophies, so they were not just followers of others, and both, especially Epicurus, claimed that he was completely original. Pyrrho, many individuals have tried to make a disconnect between his philosophy and those of Eastern religions, but I think it's safe to say that both were heavily influenced by their contemporaries, and both happened to live in a time where there was increasing globalization. For example, Alexander the Great pretty much, at least for a time, included all of these regions at least in one currency zone. So that's obviously very important, and very much the world has pretty much throughout human history started off as many different tribes, but many things such as currency has continued to unite people, religion has continued to unite people. People say that religion divides people, but you know, most people are divided in like 4 religions. So that's like 4 massive tribes. It's very, very more consolidated than it was previously. They both avoided luxury, pleasure, and wealth. Maybe less so for Epicurus, and Epicurus was sort of criticized for not, but I believe that they both, at least maybe they did not practice, this is something that they both believed. But in terms of a difference was that Pyrrho sort of gave up his career as a painter to sort of live a more lackadaisical life, whereas Epicurus sort of, and by the end of his life, he was sort of pretty much a king in his own school, the garden. So that is Pyrrho and Epicurus. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watched some of the previous ones I've made if you haven't already seen them, and some of the ones I will be making in the future. Thanks so much. Bye.